Hello, everyone. I'm David Welch, director of the Stubblefield Institute for Civil Political Communications at Shepherd University. There is a slight echo in my voice, and we're trying to take care of that, so bear with us on that count. In any event, welcome to tonight's installment of the American Conversation Series. Tonight's forum, Fixing Congress, is an evening with Congressman Derek Kilmer and Congressman Tom Graves, the chair and co-chair of the Select Committee to Modernize Congress. Derek Kilmer has been the representative for Washington's 6th Congressional District for 7 years. Tom Graves has represented Georgia's 14th Congressional District for 10 years. Both gentlemen serve on the influential Appropriations Committee. We are carrying this event via Zoom conferencing and live streaming through Facebook. Due to security precautions, all the guests for this event will be muted with face cam also turned off, and that's to ensure the security and anonymity of the participants. However, the chat function will be open for questions during the event. We will be unable to get to all of your questions, but we will get to as many as possible. I also want to thank our student board member, Jordan Jalil, and our board member, Peter Loge, director of the Washington University Ethics Project, for assisting with the questions that I will be asking. Gentlemen, welcome to the Stubblefield Institute. It's great to have you here, at least virtually, on the Shepherd University campus.
Thanks for having us.
Let's start with a basic question, sort of an overall question. A lot of people may not understand how Congress works. Can you talk to us about the mechanics of a congressional office and some of the support offices? For example, how much of a budget each member of Congress gets, what's spent on it, et cetera, and also organizations like the Congressional Research Service, the Office of the Legislative Counsel, and so forth. In other words, what are you trying to modernize?
Tom, do you want to take the first half since you chaired the Ledge Branch Appropriations, and then maybe I'll talk a little bit about our committee?
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great. Well, Derek, it's good to be with you on this Zoom and Facebook Live event. And David and the Institute, thank you for hosting us. That's a great question about how do different offices operate. And probably the best way to describe it is they're much like individual entities or organizations. Every office operates independently. Every office has a different, what's referred to as an MRA, Members Representative Allowance or budget that equates to maybe the cost of living in the area, travel distances, and other uniquenesses about a district. But there are caps on number of employees that an office can have. There are salary caps within offices as well. But probably for the most part, the individual operations are really up to the member and up to the staff, how they set up their staff, the organization of their staff, the hierarchy, how they might title their staff, and then ultimately to the focus of the office. Primarily, it would be constituent services, which is really our number one objective as a member of Congress, is to be that interface between your constituents and the federal government. And then what is the focus from a committee perspective? Where will you specialize, and how will you prepare or gear your office to focus, like in mine and Derek's case, the Appropriations Committee, to have individuals that are sort of in that line of thought, and that's their wheelhouse. Basically, that's what they are gifted to do and trained to do, and have prepared to work in that area as well. But ultimately, to answer the question, it's really up to each and every individual member and how they operate their office, how they spend their resources, which are fully disclosed. Everything's transparent. Individuals can go online and look up how members spend dollars and where those dollars are allocated. But a lot of rules, as you can imagine, are around those. But a lot of that is constraining. A lot of that provides a lot of duplicity, and creates a great opportunity for me to hand it off here to Derek to talk about efficiencies that can come out of this operation in the House of Representatives. So over to you, Derek.
And Derek, just one thing I'd like to interject, because I don't think I did this in the intro. Tom Graves of Georgia is a Republican and the co-chair of the committee, and Derek Kilmer is a Democrat, a chairman of the committee. And to many of us, it's just heartening to see a Republican and Democrat work so closely and so well together. So, Derek?
You bet. Thanks, David, and thanks for having us too. It's good to be here with Tom, who's been a terrific partner and a good friend as we work on this committee. I think you ask a question that, that has been a common refrain for folks, which is, so what's the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress? What's that about? And about every 2 to 3 decades or so, Congress realizes that it's not functioning the way it ought to, and they create a committee to do something about it. And this year's committee is called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. And it's been charged with trying to figure out what the problems are in Congress and to recommend some solutions. We're the latest incarnation. The last one was formed in 1992. And our mandate's pretty broad. We were tasked with looking at things like House rules and procedures, technology and innovation, the recruitment, retention, and diversity of staff, how members of Congress communicate with constituents, and where we can find ways for things to work better, including, as Tom mentioned, trying to find areas of savings where, right now, one of the challenges, you have 435 largely independent contractors. And so when you think about things like technology and innovation, you're probably not getting the best deal if 435 separate offices are buying 435 different sets of technology, of PCs and cell phones and things like that. And so, among the things that our committee has looked at is also, how do we drive greater bang for the buck for the American taxpayer as well. And I will mention one of the things that we've looked at, we've also looked at some things that don't fit neatly into our mandate, but that we feel are important, like civility. And I know that that's, part of the mission of the Stubblefield Institute. And we're looking at that probably for the same reason that this institute exists, which is, I think, people see opportunities to have Congress work better and be a more civil place where there's more progress and less partisanship. We've also just passed a set of 12 recommendations focused on the continuity of government and that address some of the challenges that congressional offices have faced working through a global pandemic. And that too wasn't something that we set out to work on, although we started looking at issues around continuity before anyone had heard of coronavirus. And it just so happened that turned out to be very, very relevant this year.
I appreciate what you said about civility, and I know that we're going to come back to that at a couple of different times. I'm interested, though, when you look at some of the reforms that everybody seems to think that are needed, how do you build the political will for that to happen? As you said, you've got 435 individual contractors, then you have constituencies and then constituencies within constituencies. How do you go about building the political will for that and getting a buy-in from all of the members of Congress? Any ideas on that?
Well, maybe I'll take the first shot at this, and then I'll see if Tom wants to chime in as well. I started off by recognizing my gratitude for Tom Graves, who is vice chair of this committee. When we both got this assignment, we decided to do things a little bit differently as a committee. It's a committee that is truly bipartisan. Tom and I work as partners, as do all of the members of our committee. And I really do feel lucky to have such terrific partners like Tom in this enterprise. And what is meant is the collaborative approach of this committee has been really encouraging. We're proving that it's possible for Democrats and Republicans to sit down together, engage in tough discussions, and ultimately find solutions to the challenges that we all face, and that can be bipartisan. In fact, we've now passed dozens of recommendations, and every recommendation we've passed so far has had unanimous support out of committee. That we've I think, including the 12 that we just passed, we're at 57 recommendations. We did something also unique. Usually when you asked kind of how Congress works from a standpoint of our staffs, generally what happens when you get a committee, when a new committee is established, the committee gets funding, and generally what happens is you divide by 2, or sometimes one party gets 1/3 of the money and the other party gets 2/3 of the money. And Tom and I had a conversation early on to say, the problems are too big, and frankly, they require a broad buy-in from both parties. What if we do things a little bit different so that, we have a staff where it's not half the staff in red jerseys and half the staff in blue jerseys, but a staff that's all wearing fixed Congress jerseys. So we're a unique committee in Congress in that we have a unified nonpartisan staff with one budget, one office, and that breaks with the tradition of dividing resources by parties. And so we're taking that approach, and as a consequence, been able to find common ground. That's what it's going to take. I mean, one of the things, and it's paying off. Listen, we're the first select committee, really in modern history, in a generation, that's actually passed recommendations. And we've decided to adopt recommendations on a rolling basis. Most previous select committees have issued an end-of-year report that contain all of their recommendations. And our approach is to find consensus and then move. And, I served on a prior select committee called the Joint Select Committee on Budget and Appropriations Process Reform. And on that committee, we spent a year holding hearings and developing recommendations, only to see all of our work go up in flames. And that committee passed 0 recommendations. And we decided early on that the Committee on Modernizing Congress was going to take a different approach. So we've unanimously passed 57 recommendations. And then we're turning those recommendations into legislation so that it's not just a recommendation that doesn't go anywhere, but that we can get that buy-in from members of Congress. And we have greater credibility because we've passed these recommendations with unanimous support.
And I'll follow up on that, David. And you can tell from Derek's heart, he has a spirit about him that really is a unique leadership trait and quality in Washington, and that he wants to see everyone arrive at a consensus. He's not driving his agenda. He's not driving the party's agenda. He is working on behalf of everyone. And he started off from day one when we were all assigned together, and we sort of got to make some recommendations based on the rules. We're required to have so many people from the Rules Committee or from House Administration or from the newest incoming class, and so we had some I guess some guidelines in which the committee would populate. But then once those members were announced, Derek he called for us to go on basically a mini retreat together, to get to know one another, to begin strategizing and hearing everybody's individual thoughts, and then taking the collective thoughts of the committee, and then moving forward to listening from all members of the House, including a lot of our leadership. We had a hearing where we heard from every member, because it was really important, not only to Derek, but to the entire committee, that the House of Representatives, Republican and Democrat, all had input into the process from day one. And it's amazing the ideas we received, things that a unique perspective from one member could have such broad impact on all members and ultimately on the objective of the committee, and that is to make Congress work better for the American people. And then from there, Derek led the committee in a way that wasn't public. It was really, okay, let's get together, let's talk about what are the objectives over the next couple of months, and how do we arrive at that? And we did that in a small group together as a committee. And he talked about the traditions of Congress and committees. Normally what happens is the Republicans, they all go over in this corner and they plan their strategy to scuttle the Democrats. And then the Democrats go over in this corner and plan their strategy to outflank the Republicans. We've never met not together as one solid group, Republican and Democrat. We've always met together, and I think it's that kind of example which Derek has illustrated for the entire House. It works, and we have a high threshold. We have to get 9 of 12 of our committee to be in agreement to pass anything out of committee, and in fact, he's exceeded that by getting unanimous each and every time, which has brought success. So it's a large part to Derek's vision for the committee.
As the director of an institute that focuses on political civility, I get questions quite often, or I get eyeballs rolled at me sometimes when I tell them what we're trying to do. Someone asked me once, is it easier to instill civility in politics or cure Alzheimer's, and to wish me the best of luck? And I'm sure that you might get reactions like that as well. But politics in America has always had a certain incivility to it. By the end of his second term, George Washington was so loathed that Congress voted against recessing for 30 minutes to wish him happy birthday. Fights have broken out on the floor of Congress and so on. Is the effort possible? Should we keep tilting at the civility windmill?
I think it's really important. You know, and let me say a couple things. You are right that you know, our founders did not expect that we'd all sit around a table holding hands, singing "Kumbaya" together. You know, that's not the nature of our political process. But I think there's an exhaustion by the American people with just the level of partisan bickering and the degree to which too often all of this gets treated like a game to be won rather than problems to be solved. And, you know, and I think that's really driven some of the recommendations by the committee. I mentioned we've made some recommendations in the civility space, and I'll just give you a few examples. So, you know, when you are a new member, new to Congress, it's not dissimilar to, you know, being a new student at a university. You go through orientation. And literally, you know, when this class went through orientation, you had Democrats assigned to one bus and Republican members assigned to another bus. And much of the new member orientation, you were kind of kept to your tribe. And, you know, so one of our recommendations was stop doing that. You know, let's not ingrain the partisanship from the beginning, but let's offer orientation in a nonpartisan way, in a way that can promote civility and actually have some lessons on civility during new member orientation. There used to be bipartisan retreats for members and their families where, you know, rather than, as Tom mentioned, right now at the beginning of a Congress and usually at the beginning of each year, the Democrats take their retreat and Republicans take their retreat, and a not insignificant amount of time is basically spent on how you can hose the other party, to use a technical term. And, you know, so much of being able to make progress, you know, and this came when we had hearings on the subject of civility, and we brought former members, and they said, you know, what relationships really matter, and don't sleep on trying to foster that relationship through retreats. And so that's been one of our recommendations. Similarly, you know, we made a recommendations about having some dedicated space in the Capitol where members can interact with one another, Democrats and Republicans, in you know, because right now, actually this is somewhat changed over COVID, in that we're not allowed to hang out on the House floor. But prior to COVID, really the only place where Democrats and Republicans really engaged one another was on the House floor. And that's not the greatest environment in which to do that. You know, we had some policies related to updating some of the committee policies to increase bipartisan learning opportunities for staff, and doing the type of agenda setting that Tom mentioned that our committee did, where committee staff and members could come together for retreats to, you know, encourage better policymaking and encourage better collaboration. I think this is an area where we know there's a lot of work to do, and we're continuing to work on this. And I think it's really important that institutes like yours exist, acknowledging that incivility in our politics is not limited to Congress, and frankly, it's not limited to politics, right? The you know, to some degree, our the toxicity in our politics is a reflection of just a very divided country right now. And I think all of us want to see just more progress on behalf of the American people.
Yeah, you know, and David, thinking about some of the comments there, look, this committee has been a bright spot. It really has for us, those that have been a part of it. And I think for a lot of the members who have been able to engage this committee and see their thoughts and recommendations sort of move through the process. But it's an example that it can be done, that Republicans and Democrats can work together. I mean, you look at mine and Derek's different districts, and and the difference of the regions, and mine's a very, very conservative Republican district in the South. His is a district that's very Democrat, that's in the Northwest. And but the fact that we can set that aside and work together, along with all the other members that come from very diverse backgrounds as well. But I would highlight that while we've been able to reach consensus, that doesn't mean we've always been in agreement. You've just never seen that disagreement public. And that's because we've always had our conversations in private. And as far as where we might have a difference, I think our objectives were always aligned in what we were hoping to do. But oftentimes there were disagreements and very valid arguments on both sides. And it wouldn't be necessarily a partisan disagreement, but it may be a process, or how does it function, or don't think it's necessary, or maybe it's not the right time, a lot of different reasons for something. But I highlight that because we've had to work through differences, and we've done it in a way that I hope is an example for other committees, that you don't have to express those differences publicly. You don't have to call a hearing just so that there can be an expression of disagreement. In fact, all of our public hearings have been hearings on educating members and the public on a topic or an issue that we're trying to learn more about, or showing or displaying agreement and recommendations that we're passing out. And that's very unique. I mean, for a committee to operate that way, but that again, that's to Derek's leadership and how he wants to see it operate. And as a result, it's been successful. So the point of, I guess, me saying all that is that it's okay to have disagreements, and it's okay to be at loggerheads at times, as long as you're moving forward and you're working through it. And that's what we've been doing. And in fact, there's still some outstanding issues that we're working through as a committee that I know we'll have success in the end. But it's not always perfect and kumbaya through the process. We have to understand everybody's unique perspective and point of view from their background or their own personal experiences.
Just want to remind our viewers that you're listening to or watching the American Conversation series, Fixing Congress, with Representatives Derek Kilmer and Tom Graves, the chair and co-chair of the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress. I also want to apologize for the echo that you hear in my voice. We've not been able to fix that, but I'm not the one you want to listen to. It's them. So as long as they're working, I guess I'm okay with that. A lot of critics, gentlemen, say that incivility is the result of political incentives. Members of Congress and their staffs would, by and large, like the Congress to be a more civil place, but voters, especially many who live in gerrymandered House districts, punish elected officials who are seen to be too nice to the other side. Can you solve civility without solving the political incentives? That's a tough question, right?
Oh, that's a fun question, and of course you started off with the term critics. Yeah, that jumped out at me. I mean, there's genuine disagreement on issues and or maybe philosophy and such like that. I think where it's crossed the line is it's gotten personal, and so when a constituency expects you just to oppose something because it's of a person, from a person, or from a party, I don't know, that's not why I ran for office. I ran to be an independent thinker who was providing ideas and solutions from my background and from my district, and to be that voice to try to impact things in a positive way. Anybody can go and vote against the other party, or vote against a person, or express disagreement. It takes a stronger individual to be able to step into that arena and try to work out an agreement with someone that you're in disagreement with. And so we all know it's been done in the past. There's been periods of time where there's been lack of civility in politics, and there's been times when there's been a lot of camaraderie and collective spirit. I think right now we're just in a time in our history of our country where there's a lot of energy and there's a lot of spirited debate, and which is fine until it gets personal and you lose perspective as to what the objectives are.
I'll also chime in here, and I'll give an example of some good things that are happening, and then I'll mention some areas where I think there's a need for reform. The Bipartisan Policy Center has been doing exchanges where they have a Democrat go to a Republican's district and a Republican go to the Democrat's district. And I think to some degree, part of the rationale behind it is to, you can do a better job of understanding where someone's coming from when you actually see where someone's coming from. I had Steve Womack, who's a conservative Arkansas Republican, come to Washington State, and we took him into Olympic National Park and we went up Hurricane Ridge on a really cold, windy day. It's called Hurricane Ridge for a reason. But the National Park Service showed him some of the maintenance backlog in our park. And as we headed back down the mountain, he said, "Kilmer, now I kind of understand why you yammer on about the maintenance backlog in the National Park Service." And we took him to the Port of Tacoma and had a presentation on freight mobility, and the port did a bang up job of saying, these are the number of containers that come into our port that end up in Arkansas, and here's how many containers come from Arkansas and go to the rest of the world from our port. And as we drove away, he said, "Kilmer, all of a sudden I care about freight mobility in the greater Puget Sound area." And so there are things like that are happening. And I will tell you, 95% of the people who heard about that trip said, "God, that's really cool that you're doing." And I went to Arkansas too and learned about some of their priorities. And I would say 95% of my constituents responded to that very positively and said, thanks for making the effort. There was 5% who said, "Gosh, I don't want you interacting with Republicans. I want you out there beating Republicans." And but it's not the majority voice. It can be a loud voice, but it's not a majority voice. I will say the state of Washington has done a few things that I actually think are pretty valuable reforms. These are not issues that the select committee is taking up, in part because it's outside of the committee's mandate, and in part, as Tom said, it takes 9 votes to pursue reforms on our committee, and I'm not sure we could get 9 votes on these. But one, our state has a bipartisan redistricting commission, so you don't see those very intensely gerrymandered districts. We've got some. We certainly have blue districts and red districts, but you haven't seen districts packed. And we've got a lot of districts that are pretty diverse. And as a consequence, when someone says, from a very deep blue part of my district, "Gosh, I don't even know any Trump voters," to you, I can say, "Well, gosh, 3 of the 6 counties I represent voted for Donald Trump. So yeah, I know some Trump voters." So there's some value in having that approach to redistricting. In our state, we've seen it enable perhaps more civil discourse than you might otherwise see. We also have a top 2 primary. So the top 2 vote getters, regardless of political party, move on to the general election. And in fact, Dan Newhouse, who's a member of our committee, when he was first elected to the committee, when he was first elected to Congress, he won his seat in a general election against another Republican. And, I would say Dan got the bulk of the votes from more moderate Republicans and probably all of the Democrats in his district, which is probably only about 30 to 40% of the district, depending upon the election, against a very conservative, talk radio host. So I think that top 2 primary system, we're similarly seeing in Washington's 10th congressional district, two Democrats are going to face off in a general election. And so I think that has maybe changed some of the political incentives to the point of the question. I would mention one other thing that I think is one of those systemic challenges that I think contribute negatively, and that's our campaign finance reform system, or our campaign finance system. I think there's too much money in politics, and I think that drives some of the incivility as well, because I can tell you what, if I send out an email on behalf of my campaign saying, here's some of the great bipartisan work I'm doing, I'm not sure it generates the amount of support that something when I'm drawing a stark contrast with the Republican Party. And that's not unique to Washington's 6th congressional district. That's just unfortunately a dynamic that exists within our political system right now.
Kelly Johnston, who is the former Secretary of the United States Senate in the 90s and a member of our board, asks a question, if the two of you care to touch on the misuse of executive authority via executive orders, something that we're under right now, but both sides have done that. I don't know if that's outside your jurisdiction, but would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, maybe I'll take the first shot, and then I'm sure Tom will want to chime in on this too. We've, as a committee, had a number of hearings related to the restoration of Article 1, of Congress as a co-equal branch of government. And I think it's out of a recognition that certainly to your point, David, both parties have seen presidents leverage executive orders, and to some degree, it's I think a reaction to Congress not adequately legislating. So much of what we're looking at is trying to, one, make sure that Congress is punching at least at or above its weight, not below its weight. Some of that means having the type of expertise of staff, having the committees firing on all cylinders so that Congress is able to do its job more effectively on behalf of the American people. We're even having discussions about that with regard to appropriating. So much now is driven by the executive branch in that arena. That's a conversation that we've had hearings on, and our committees having conversations about, okay, what could some reforms look like in that budget and appropriations space as well.
Yeah, Derek really touched on probably the most important thing we can do. I mean, the executive orders, that's sort of outside of our jurisdiction as a committee on modernizing Congress. But we've identified areas where Congress really isn't utilizing all the tools it has. In fact, it's ceded much of authority over to the administrations or the executive branch in so many cases. And so the committee's been able to highlight some of those instances, and a lot of it will deal with, and we have a few recommendations that have been previous, but more that we hope to generate in the next month that deal with the budgeting and appropriations processes. That is one great responsibility that we as the House of Representatives have been given and bestowed upon us, that we quite frankly have sort of stepped away from, or over time let it slip and allow the executive branch to utilize its authority, in that case, step into our shoes and do our job for us. And so there's a great opportunity there for the House of Representatives, but that's one that takes the political courage. Maybe you were speaking to earlier, David, that it's so easy sometimes to do nothing, and the difficulty comes in taking action, making difficult choices, and oftentimes Congress struggles with that, and it happens no matter what the political makeup is with the presidency and the House and the Senate. But one tool at the House's disposal clearly is judicial action against any executive order that we chose. But again, that's outside of what this committee is working on, and that is sort of bringing everybody together and trying to row in the same direction.
I remember when I first worked as a staff person out of college in the 1970s, and I'm dating myself, when I worked for a member of Congress on the Hill. And I remember lots of members, they took junkets, and most of them stayed around for the weekend. They didn't try to get out on Thursday nights. There was a lot of socialization that just occurred amongst my boss and his friends on both his side of the aisle and the other side of the aisle. Is there a way that you can have a reform that would bring or allow or result in members just spending more time together? I know you mentioned a place where they could meet other than the House floor, but maybe this won't ever get fixed. I'm not sure, but I'm just wondering, do you all ever talk about ways in which members of Congress can travel more together or spend weekends together or do more things together? Is that ever going to be like it used to be in the good old days?
Well, so one of the mandates of the committee is to look at the issue of calendar and schedule. And I actually think that's one of the very significant contributors to the problem right now. Last year, as an example, Congress was in Washington, D.C. for 57 full days and 56 travel days. 57 full days, 56 travel days out of that entire year. And so if you think about what a travel day looks like, a little bit different for those of us from the West Coast, we're hopping on an airplane at 8 a.m. Pacific time, landing in DC and getting to our offices at about 5 p.m. So it's not those travel days are usually 6:30 p.m. votes on a Monday, and then votes on the Thursday morning, and then everybody is wheels up. And one of the discussions that our committee has had is it worth looking at changing that calendar, at least laying out some principles of what a calendar might look like, really with two goals in mind. One, to have more time to legislate, for committees to meet. You've got, I mentioned 57 full days, 56 travel days. The average member of Congress is on 5.4 committees and subcommittees. And when you try to jam all those committee meetings into that very limited amount of time, no wonder when you watch C-SPAN, you will often notice that committees don't have a whole lot of their members there. So some of it is just to try to create more space on the calendar where members of Congress are spending more time in committee, more time engaging with each other to solve problems, and less time in airports and on airplanes. So that's one of the areas we've looked at. But the other benefit of it, and you've actually seen this somewhat during COVID, not that we can actually get together, but the calendar has had votes Monday through Friday until reasonably late on Friday, and then starting votes again on Monday morning, where Congress will be in for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and it will do Monday through Friday votes. And what you've seen is a whole bunch of members stay for the weekend, because at least for me, it doesn't make sense to fly back to Washington State on Saturday morning and then have to turn around and fly back to Washington, D.C. on Sunday, just to be able to sleep in my own bed for one night. That's only a COVID reform so far, but there is some benefit to it if we continued that outside of COVID, particularly if members could actually interact with each other, and be there for the weekend. And David, that kind of gets at the dynamic that you were referencing, where, certainly when we've talked to former members, they reference the fact, gosh, it's a lot harder to come after somebody as, you awful human being when, you've interacted with them socially, when certainly when members used to live in Washington, D.C., when your kids played soccer together, it was really hard to go out on the House floor and trash the other person.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. The calendar is probably one of the greatest changes we can make that would really, one, create more efficiency, a better work product, maybe a little better purpose and feeling of accomplishment from a member perspective. But ultimately relationship developing. The breakdown in civility oftentimes is just because people don't know each other, and they've never had, one, they haven't taken the time, or they just haven't had the time to get to know anyone. I remember Derek and I were doing some conversation, this might have been a year ago, and they said, well, if there's one thing, I think it was an interview, and they said, if there's one thing you could change, wave the magic wand, what would it be? And for me, it was something I know we can't do, but if I was waving the magic wand, it would be to require every member to move themselves and their family to the Washington, D.C. area if they were elected, to make that commitment, or at least have that knowledge that that had to happen. And the reason was, and I'm a person that's commuted. I'm on the East Coast. I can get on a flight, there's 10, 12, 14 options a day. It's an hour, 20-minute flight. I can commute to DC back and forth every week without a problem. But by doing that, I never really know anyone. I don't get to know anybody other than it's in my committee or maybe within my own delegation. But had my family been in DC, then my children would have been going to school with potentially Derek's children and others. And and you've been doing sporting events together. You'd have had life together outside of your career. And it would be much like any other family experiences in their own community, where they're actually spending community together. And we, quite frankly, we just don't have that luxury or that ability as members. And I just know it'd be a lot harder to say bad things about a person who my daughter goes to school with their daughter. It just changes that whole dynamic altogether, because there's that connection. But it's amazing how we really don't know each other. No matter how hard we try, it's really hard to get to know each and every person on that deep personal basis.
One of the popular reform proposals that's been put out is to go to a biannual budgeting to help Congress get back to regular budget order. Is that on the table?
Yeah, we're talking about it. That was one of the recommendations that did not make it over the hurdle on the Select Committee on Budget and Appropriations Process Reform. We had a hearing with the leaders of that committee, and they basically said, we commend our recommendations that we weren't able to get passed to your committee. And I think, our committee's taking a look at moving those.
What would be the advantages of that, Derek?
Well, so to some degree, and Tom may want to chime in on this as well. You've seen a lot of dysfunction in the budget and appropriations space, and that's not because there aren't terrific people working in that space. It's just, if you look at recent history, you've seen far too many continuing resolutions, far too many government shutdowns. And that has an enormous impact on our constituents, not just on federal workers, but heck, I grew up in a town at the base of a national park. When that national park shut down for 19 days, that was killer on the local economy. It just was brutal. And so if your starting point is, how do we make sure that we're not seeing government shutdowns and continuing resolutions and trying to get to some semblance of sanity from a process standpoint, I think one of the things you would say is there's a few areas where the process breaks down. And one of them is just setting a top line number for how much have you got to spend. And having to do that on an annual basis is probably not necessary. You could probably do a biennial resolution, and where you could have, if something comes up, you could do some sort of a off-year corrections or changes. But if you at least knew what the size of the pie was for 2 years, that could maybe facilitate a smoother process on the appropriations side. Bearing in mind that the budget resolution is largely, in recent history, the budget resolution has largely been a political document. But the most important thing is it sets those allocations for, how much money do you have to spend within the 12 appropriations bills. If you can at least lock those in for a couple of years, it probably makes the appropriations process go smoother.
Yeah, in large part, we've been operating in that sort of that concept. So in a way, to be codifying what has happened over the last maybe 6 years or so. But just to add a little more detail to what Derek was describing, I came from a General Assembly where we didn't have two committees. We didn't have a budget committee and appropriations committee. And so the way Washington works, again, it's in a complicated form that it created itself, and that is, in order to go through the appropriations committee and determine how you spend your money, another committee has to meet and determine how much can be spent. And that generally, takes till late April. If it were on time and everything was working well, maybe late April, that is determined. But the fiscal year ends in September, at the end of September. And so, in talking about the calendar and the limited number of days, and Derek described 57 or so, 60 days that we were actually work days in Washington, D.C. last year. And now you're already into May, and you only have a couple months to go to determine how you're going to fully fund the entirety of the federal government. You're just it's an impossible puzzle to solve ultimately in the end, and that leads you to a failure point. And so biennial budgeting sort of releases that pressure. It's something you're going to predetermine anyhow, but give the Appropriations Committee in the House and the Senate more space in which to operate. Either give them more space or put more days on the calendar. But either without those items, you're forced to failure in the end, and that ultimately has a negative impact on all of our constituency.
You have told us earlier in the program that there have been past efforts to modernize Congress and past efforts to instill more civility and better relationships in Congress. And everything that we're hearing tonight from the two of you is so encouraging in the way you're going about it. Can you share with us why you think it might work this time? I mean, is there something that gives you hope that says we might get to the right thing this time and really make it happen?
Yeah, there are a few things that give me hope, and there's a quote from a British rabbi who says there's a difference between optimism and hope. Optimism is the belief that things will get better, and hope is the belief that together we can make things better. And, I think to some degree, I have hope because I think together the stars are aligned, Democrats and Republicans, certainly on our committee. But I think you're seeing an appetite within Congress to try to actually have the place function better on behalf of the American people. That's why you saw a strong bipartisan vote to create this committee in the first place. It's why you've seen 57 unanimous recommendations passed, and I think we've got a lot more to do in the time we have left. But also, I'll also point out, we're doing something a little unique here in that we're not just issuing a report, we're turning them into legislation. And we've already passed our first resolution out of the House with, again, strong bipartisan support. And you're already starting to see some of the proposed reforms getting implemented. And, I think that that's a testament to the good work of the committee, Democrats and Republicans, who've just said, hey, we're going to kind of set any personal agendas at the door and just try to work on making Congress function better on behalf of the American people.
Yeah, and for me, I think we've, maybe there was hope in the beginning and high expectations early on. And I just feel like we have met those and have more to do. And I think we're going to exceed those expectations. As Derek mentioned, not only we've had success as a committee just passing out the recommendations, something that hasn't been done for a couple of decades by other select committees, but the fact they've passed as legislation is taking it to a whole nother level. And there's certainly more to do. But what excites me, and David, this is my last term in Congress after over a decade. This is sort of the capstone to my career. And ironically, I was placed on appropriations my very first term as a committee I did not want to be on. And I was assigned there, basically by Speaker Boehner to be a disruptor, right? Because certain things were out of control, and it was bringing it back, but go disrupt things and in essence, blow it up, right? And now at the end of my career, I'm assigned to the committee to fix things. It's sort of an ironic career trajectory. But knowing that what we've passed and the recommendations that are forthcoming, we're going to have just a massive playbook sitting on the shelf for the next Congress to pull from. And I know Derek will still be in the next Congress, as will many other members of the committee. But the rest of the House is invested in this from day one, from the first member listening day. And that playbook will be sitting on the shelf for them to pull from each and every day when they need that to interject a new idea into the process to provide that grease to get things moving again. And so I'm certainly pleased and excited to be concluding this with Derek in this way. He's led us here.
Congressman, great follow up,
David,
because this is your final few months as a member of Congress after being there for a decade. What's changed in the last decade in your mind is in the way, as it relates to the way Congress functions and is a functional body? Is it gotten worse, or is there hope that it could get better?
There's certainly hope it can get better. What's changed that I've noticed more than anything is the recognition that there are problems in the admission of that. And I don't think that was acknowledged early on in my first days. But to know that the body, at the beginning of last term, voted as they did to create this special select committee, which ultimately, in my understanding, the history of this idea came from a bipartisan group that got together and wanted to change things and wanted to make things better. And I guess it was maybe the problem solvers, some group that came together and said, look, here's some ideas we have to get moving forward. And that is, how do we fix Congress? So for me, the biggest change I've noticed is the recognition that things can be better and they need to be better in order for us to best represent and better serve the American people.
Given all of the challenges and all the opportunities that you both have and that your committee has going forward, I'd like to hear from each of you what you think is the biggest impediment to congressional reform. Is it our culture? Is it our work? Is it the politics? What are the barriers, and what will it take to fix it? And what would our responsibility, us regular people back home, what is our responsibility in that?
sorry, I couldn't hear what you asked. You said, what's the biggest barrier to what? My internet glitched.
It's what's the biggest barrier to moving forward on congressional reform? Is it our culture? Is it our politics? And what will it take to fix it? And what is our responsibility at home, back your constituents? What is our responsibility in that?
Well, you know what? I actually am going to answer that with a positive rather than with a negative. I actually give David, you and the Stubblefield Institute great credit for actually taking the time to dive into the work of this committee. As you can imagine, we're not exactly burning it up on cable news as a committee, right? Despite the fact that we have a terrific communications staff person, what I think draws eyeballs is conflict. And when you asked whether there was hope for moving some of this forward, to some degree, part of what gives me hope is entities that are invested in reform and actually improving how things work. And the Stubblefield Institute is an example of that. There's a whole cohort of organizations that I lovingly refer to as the reform industrial complex. But I say that because they really, and some of them come from, a more conservative bent, and some of them come from a more progressive bent. But without exception, they come from a bent of just wanting to see this work better. And so, I guess, to maybe that was a response to your last question, but also a bit of a response to this question too. Lincoln said public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, you can accomplish anything. And I think, you will start to see reform and you'll start to continue to see progress on that when the American people demand it. And I think they're demanding it. And I think there's extraordinary organizations, including this institute, that can help drive it.
Yeah. Yeah, that was really, Derek answered it so well, because, I don't consider it a barrier. I mean, it's certainly a challenge. It's just the advocacy component, right? As you mentioned, it's different, but that's also, when I think about the distractions that are out there for members and all the different responsibilities and the committee assignments and the policy they're working on that pulls their attention in other directions. In some cases, that can be a positive for us too, because we're just working and working and working, and they see that they have confidence that this committee is working in the right direction. And Derek gets the same responses I do from members, and it's literally they'll be having a bad day and they'll come up to you and say, "What do y'all do? Tell me something encouraging y'all are passing out. What's the newest thing? What's the they see this committee as that bright spot, as sort of that space of refuge that they can go to and share an idea or a concept, or at least come to and say, hey, give me a little encouragement today. Y'all are still moving forward, right, on some of these ideas. So I think we're in a really good position here to do some great things, and really excited about it.
We've just had one more question come in from our audience, and we'll end after this because we are at our hour deadline. The question from Daniel Bennett is, what is the importance of making it easier for citizens to engage in hearings?
Well, one of the things that we've looked at as a committee and made some recommendations on is acknowledging that the people's house needs to be accessible to the people. And that's not just with regard to hearings. So I'll give you an example. We've made some recommendations about requiring all House proceedings to provide closed caption service, in improving congressional websites for people with disabilities. When we talk about accessibility to the process, our committee is really invested in making sure that that's accessibility for everybody. And again, I think every member is conscious of the fact that representative is not just their title, it's also their job description. We represent the folks in our districts, and being able to engage them and giving them an avenue for participation really matters, and it helps us do our jobs.
Yeah, I agree with Derek 100%. And the committee early on tackled this objective, and that's how can you make things easier for constituents to track what their members are doing and to see them in action and working, and in a way that the technology is there, the ability is there. There's some areas where we can improve technology to allow constituents to see more detail amendment ideas that are offered in committees, and things like that. Votes in committees. How did a member vote on an amendment, or how they vote on the actual passage of a bill? Things like that can be public record. But so we want. I think ultimately, when the objective of this committee was to make Congress work better for the American people, and that's to allow them to engage and participate in the process. And so that's why some of those recommendations are geared that way.
And that will end this installment of the American Conversation series, Fixing Congress, an evening with Derek Kilmer and Tom Graves. I just want to thank both of the members of Congress for their time tonight and for their sincerity and their efforts to do good work for the American people in Congress. To Tom Graves, we wish you the best as you end your career. And to Derek Kilmer, we can only hope that you'll keep the fight alive and to continue trying to make the kind of reforms that the American people, I think, really do want. Despite that we are in a divided nation, I do think we might be able to come together on congressional, at least reforming Congress. I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. It's been a great hour, and I'm quite sure that if we were in a live audience tonight, that both of our representatives that are with us virtually would be being given a standing ovation at this time. That will do it for this edition of the American Conversation series. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Dave.